Welcome to Becoming and Belonging, a journey of identity and culture. I'm your host, Amy Huggins from Ascension Wellness. Each week, we embark on a journey of discovering who we truly are, navigating the nuance of identity and culture, and learning what it means to belong in our own skin and in the world. We are talking about transforming through sacred conversations. I am thrilled to introduce our guest, Yvonne Caputo. Yvonne has been a teacher. She taught in the Erie, Pennsylvania public schools for 18 years. She has been the vice president of human resources at a retirement community, a corporate trainer and consultant, and a psychotherapist. She has a master's degree in education and clinical psychology. Her book, Flying with Dad, is a story about her relationship with her father through his telling of World War II stories. Her second book, Dying with Dad, shares how she and her dad had tough conversations about what he wanted in the end. She has always been a storyteller. She uses stories to widen students' eyes and soften clients' pain, and her stories have earned her rave reviews as a presenter and a speaker. Yvonne lives in Pennsylvania with her best friend, who is also her husband. Together, they have 3 children, 3 grandchildren, and a Bernedoodle. Yvonne, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. All that's pretty accurate. When I look back, I now say I'm deliciously semi-retired. When I look back, I just had such a full life where careers are concerned. And they just seemed to have happened. When I met and married my husband, I moved to southeastern Pennsylvania and couldn't find a teaching position. So thank goodness I had the second master's degree in clinical psych, which allowed me to go into employee assistance work. The woman who hired me said, "Do you like to do training? Do you like to do education?" And I said, "Of course." So that's how all the corporate training happened. And then I happened to be doing training for a retirement community. And 4 months after I finished that, their CEO called me and said, "Our human resource director has retired. Are you interested?" So it's just kind of this organic thing that happened, all of which I think really prepared me to write 2 books.
Wow. Yeah, it sounded, at first I was thinking like you were following breadcrumbs, and maybe that's accurate, but it also feels like an unfolding, like your life was just unfolding before you.
It did. It did.
What a gift.
I'm really pleased because I can look back and say that I really did all the things that I loved. And interesting, when I was working in employee assistance, I'd counseled adults. I did corporate training. I'd been a teacher. I'd had young students. The population I hadn't worked with was the elderly. And I'd said frequently to myself, I think that's something that I would like to do. That would be a rounding out of the career. And then lo and behold, don't I end up at a retirement community?
Wow. It's like you put in your order to the universe and ask and you shall receive.
That's a pretty accurate assessment.
Oh, that's great. I also get the feeling maybe that the process of writing your 2 books, I wonder if that was a bit of an unfolding experience for you as well.
It was.
Yeah.
It was absolutely. I can honestly say that I had thought about writing books. Wouldn't that be fun? But it never got anywhere. In 2008, cold January night, black as black could be outside, I was having my regular, normal conversation with my father.
Yeah.
He lived on the other side of the state. So it was Sunday night, and I knew not to call if there was a Steelers game or any of those kinds of things. And usually we'd talk about his doctor's appointments and his in-home care. And he was at that point a brittle diabetic, so dialysis treatment.
Mm.
And when those stopped, we didn't have much else to say. But on that one night, he told me this funny, quirky, off-the-wall story, of all things, about making an emergency landing in a B-24 in freed Belgium at the end of World War II.
Mm.
And while he was telling it, I said, Dad, hold on. I want to get a pencil and paper. And he said, what the hell do you want to do that for? He had this deep bass, profundo, resonating voice that used to scare the bejesus out of me when I was a little kid. And I said, this is really good stuff. Maybe this is something that the family would enjoy reading. Amy, what moved me in the phone call the next week, I don't know. But I said to him, Dad, if you're willing, start at the beginning.
Mm.
And story after story after story just rolled off his tongue. And I kept taking notes. And if I look back on it, I think that there was a moment when I said, I've got something here. I think I have a book. And I researched. What can you do? You can Google just about anything, you know. And so I looked for books that were the stories of individuals who fought in the war. And there were all kinds of things about Roosevelt and D-Day and Pearl Harbor and, you know, great fighters and all that kind of stuff. But the little individual, like I said, quirky things, not so much. So that, and about the same time, Dad was telling me about being in Miami Beach for basic training. It was considered to be the best boot camp in the United States. The hotels were all empty. So the Army Air Corps took it over, and that's where Dad did basic training. And he said to me, I was billeted at a hotel. And I said, well, which one? I don't remember. I said, well, do you remember where it was? And he said, yes. He said, it was at Collings Avenue. And then he gave me another intersection. So he and I both did emails. So I did research. I'd find a picture of a hotel in that very area, send it to him. Nah, that's not it. Fourth time through, the Beach Plaza Hotel. Yeah, that's it. I was a cadet. Great job. Love you, Dad.
Wow.
So those two kind of synchronous things happened to let me know to keep on going, and that in this material, I would have a book. It took 11 years to get that from first draft through second draft through third draft to publication. But you're right. It was another one of those just kind of universal unfoldings that got me there.
Wow, what a beautiful journey.
It was. It is. And it continues to be. Dad and I were not estranged, but we weren't tight.
Mm.
He was really good with the sons. They went fishing together and hunting together and just being together in that way. With his two daughters, not quite so much. And growing up, that was a relationship that I really wanted to have. I wanted to have a deeper relationship with my dad. Well, the blessing of writing the first book was that's what we got.
Right.
As his story started to unfold, I learned more and more and more about him. The more curious I was about all of it, the more he began to trust me. The more he trusted me, the more open he was. And we got to the point where he was able to tell me about the nightmares that he came home with and the flashback that he had. And he said, Yvonne, I came home and I saw guys on the streets, and we all knew we had been in the service, and nobody talked about it being a bad thing. So I looked at them and thought there was something wrong with me.
Right.
But what I was able to do with my dad was, when he told me about the nightmare, it was the same one, Amy, every night for 3 solid years.
Wow.
And in the B-24, he's in the B-24, which is a World War II plane, and it's going down. And he's supposed to get to the Bombay to bail out. But in order to get there, he has to go through this passageway. And on the sides of it, it's all stainless steel. And he can't get purchase. He can't grab onto anything to pull himself through. And my mother would wake him up. And she would say, Mike, what's the matter? And he would say, nothing, just go back to sleep. The nightmares made him dig. And he literally dug channels in the mattress.
Oh my goodness.
And that mattress had to be destroyed.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, they slowed down and eventually they went away. But for 3 years, he suffered with those. Well, I'm a psychotherapist.
Yeah.
So I said to Dad, because sarcasm was a language we both understood. I said to him, I said, well, your nightmares were normal. What the hell do you mean? Yeah. So I explained the process and how when we visualize trauma or when we're involved in trauma, that the brain hooks onto it and the brain tries to make sense of it. And nightmares is one of the ways that it tries to make sense. Yeah. And I said to him, they didn't know that, Dad. They didn't know it when you came out of the service.
Right.
They had no way to explain it. So all of these years, you thought that there was something wrong with you when, I'm sorry, it was just normal.
Right.
So, sorry, Dad, you're normal. And I say frequently, in that phone call, I could hear my father's shoulders drop.
Oh, wow.
50 or 60 years after the fact, he's finding out that what he experienced in those nightmares was a normal thing for anybody who'd witnessed trauma.
Exactly. It was a normal reaction to abnormal circumstances.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. So that, and then later on, he and a buddy went to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. They have a B-24. There are only 11 of them left out of the thousands that were created. So they go right to the World War II Museum. Dad makes a beeline to the B-24. He's walking around the fuselage, comes around the tail. Parked next to it, Amy, was a German jet, a Messerschmitt. He lost consciousness. He fell to the floor, out like a light. When he came to, his friend said, Mike, what happened? And Dad said, I don't know. So here I am explaining what a flashback is. And again, fight, flight, freeze or play dead. When you're triggered, my dad played dead.
Right.
So I asked him, I said, tell me about the Messerschmitt. He said, oh, honey, they were so fast and they were so nimble. Our gunners couldn't trail them. They couldn't shoot them out of the sky. The kind of plane that Dad was in, they would aim for the wing because the wing contained all the fuel. and
Mm.
it would break off and the plane would explode.
Yeah.
All right. So Dad said they were under us, they were over us. We were in tight formations, which meant they couldn't be bob and weave.
Yeah.
He said, honey, we were sitting ducks. And I said, okay, so you saw that plane and your brain remembered, and in a flash, you did what people do when they're triggered. You played dead. So, how do you know all this stuff? Well, Dad, it's what I do for a living. So, those kinds of things happen to us where the trust was so strong that I began to learn all kinds of things about my dad that I had never known. I finally understood the anger
Hmm.
was always just below the surface.
Yeah.
You would ask him a simple question and he would boom,
Yeah.
explode. It was never physical,
Mhm.
but it was always loud.
Mhm.
And so I hesitated a lot of times growing up, asking him for anything or wondering if I told him anything, if it would cause that explosion. Well, in talking to him those long years later, like I said, I finally understood the anger that was right below the surface, that he had no idea where it came from or why.
Right. And it sounds like such a beautiful dynamic gift for both of you. So perhaps for the first time ever, he felt seen and understood. Like you could see him, you could understand his experiences, but also you were able to help him understand his experiences and to normalize his body's reaction to things that had happened decades before,
Mhm.
which you spoke to this, but then he was able to feel safer with you and to open up with you. But then on the flip side, you're also able to understand him better yourself as his daughter, not only from your psychotherapy background, but as his little girl, you could understand the anger that his anger that you experienced in childhood better. It sounds incredibly healing for both of you.
It was. It was. And therein comes the second book. Um, Folks who read my first book questioned how I could let my dad go if he might have been saved. Where did I find the courage?
Mm.
In the mix of all of this, particularly working in a retirement community, I worked and was on the ethics committee. And we had a case of a resident who was in very late stages of dementia, could no longer communicate,
Mhm.
needed a specific kind of treatment that her daughter didn't want her to have because it would not improve her mother's quality of life. The problem was the advance directive that the resident had was written in another state.
Oh.
And the specifics in the advance directive of that state were not the same as those in Pennsylvania. So the case ended up going to court, and the resident was given two surrogates. The first surrogate would allow for the medical treatment. If it didn't work, then her daughter could step in and say, nothing more, just let mom go.
Right.
I picked up the phone and called Dad.
Mhm.
I said, do you have an advance directive? What's that? And I explained it to him, and he said, no, I don't. And I said, well, if I find an attorney and if I make the appointment and I come home, can we go and do that together? And he said, sure.
Can you explain to our listeners what exactly is an advance directive?
An advance directive is a legal document that does two things. The first thing it does is it allowed my dad to name me as his healthcare agent. that made it possible for me to make decisions on his behalf if he could no longer make them for himself. The second part of an advance directive is what he wanted and what he didn't want if he became incapacitated. So, signed, sealed, and delivered. Fast forward maybe 4 or 5 years, still in the retirement community, I was made aware of a document called the 5 Wishes. And this is an advanced directive on heart, on lots of heart. How it differed from the legally drawn one was questions like this. How did Dad want to be remembered?
Ooh.
What did he want his children to know? Did he want to be buried or cremated? What kind of a funeral did he want? It included the specifics about physical care, but it also included these extra things that, as far as I was concerned, were probably more important than just the physical things. So, trembling, I drove across the state, 6.5 hours. Document is right on the seat beside me. Dad's in the hospital again. When I went in, I just knew that it would have to be the right time, the right moment, the right atmosphere for me to bring this document up. Grace was on my side because he was in a really good mood. And I said, I have another document I'd like to go over with you, if that's okay. He lifted his legs, put them on the side of the bed, patted the seat beside him. I sat down in his warmth. We pulled up the hospital tray, and question by question, we went over it. How did he want to be remembered? He wanted to be remembered for his work with the Red Cross. And I said, well, what about the war? And he said, well, that too. Like, no big deal, right? What did he want his children to know? He wanted his children to know that he loved them. Sometimes he had a hard time showing it, but he loved them. As far as his funeral, my father was Roman Catholic. He wanted a high mass with all the smells and bells. He wanted whatever grandchild or child who was comfortable doing the readings to choose the readings. It didn't matter to him. My husband has a glorious tenor voice. So he wanted Kirk to sing the Ave Maria, the Lord's Prayer, and Amazing Grace.
Wow.
And because I was taking voice lessons at the time, he said, and you will sing too.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, oh, wow. So in 2009, Christmas, he was back in the hospital again. We had gone to see him. We talked a lot. The social worker approached me and said, when can your dad go home? I said, when he's ready. We had in-home care for him. So that was all set up. So we drove back across the state on New Year's Eve. So on the 1st, he called me, screaming, Yvonne, why did you let them take me home? Why did you say I could go home? So I held the phone out here. He was just so angry. And I just let him do it. And then when he calmed a little, I said, Dad, I told them you could go home when you were ready. It doesn't sound like you were ready.
Yeah.
And his voice got really soft. And he said, oh, hon, I'm so sorry. I yelled at you. I didn't mean it. And I said, it's okay, Dad. You were just venting. And then he said, Yvonne, can you come home? I'm scared. I said, I can't come tonight. I'll be in the car first thing in the morning. I'll find somebody to stay with you overnight so you're not alone. I'll be there.
I
I,
wonder, what did you feel in that moment when he said, I'm scared?
my heart stopped.
Yeah.
My father never said, I shouldn't say never. He told me how scared he was the first time he saw a plane go down.
Mm,
But for him to say to me, I'm scared,
right.
I knew. I knew I wasn't going to talk him out of it. I knew I was going to be in the car. He was asking me to come home.
Yeah.
And I said to him, Dad, you can't live alone anymore. And he said, I know. I said, we need to go to plan B. So I arrived home at 4:30. At 6:30, he was gone.
Oh my goodness.
And there was a thud. The neighbors had come over. We went back. Dad was on the floor. I'm not a nurse. I called emergency services. The EMTs were there in a heartbeat. One of them had me help him move my dad from the side of the bed to the foot of the bed. Um, they said it wasn't looking good. I called the hospital and said there's a do not resuscitate order on his chart. Get it to the ER. One of the EMTs said to me that his 5 wishes were too old. They were no longer good. I no longer believe that to be true. So that's why I called the hospital. Here again, Grace, the emergency room doctor called me and said, or called the EMTs and said, you can stop working on him. So I laid down beside him, put my arm over his chest, whispered in his ear that I loved him, that I knew he was going home to see Mom. And then I did what was the glue in our family. I said the Lord's Prayer in his ear, and he was gone.
Wow.
So that's how the second book came about, was how was it that I could do that? I was on automatic pilot.
Yeah.
He had trusted me, and he had created the documents that allowed me to speak for him. Every time he went into the hospital later in life, I always called the hospital and said, do a DNR with Dad, because I knew he didn't want to be a vegetable. I knew he didn't want to stay around if he wasn't healthy. So I went on an automatic pilot. Amy, Dad wanted to be carried feet first
Mm.
out of his own home.
Wow, and that's exactly what he got.
It's exactly what he got. And the EMTs put the gurney down. The ambulance lights, or the ambulance doors were open in the back. The snow's coming down an inch an hour. The light is shining on Dad's face, and there is a soft, sweet smile. And I went, yes. And the EMTs looked at me like I'd lost any marble that I might have had. And I said to them, he wanted to be carried feet first. And that's exactly what happened. So that's what, becoming and belonging.
Mhm.
I belonged. I was on Dad's team. And we had become that together.
Right. Wow, what an incredible journey, an incredible experience, and just so heartwarming. I was really reminded a lot of my own mom as you're telling your story. She had been an LPN, a nurse in nursing homes for many years. So I'm very familiar with the DNRs, and in her state, it wasn't called, what did you say? Advanced
An
direct.
advanced directive,
It was called something else, and I can't for the life of me remember what, but it's the same
a
thing.
living will.
Living will, yes, thank you.
Okay.
And they were not honored. It was like pulling teeth. I mean, they would be honored if the person in charge, the charge nurse or someone at the hospital believed in them, but they were not legally bound. And so then the medical staff would feel like, well, if I don't do everything that I can, then I could be at risk for a liability issue here. And so the living wills were so often not honored unless, as in your case, a loved one stepped in and enforced it.
Mhm.
But the loved one had to really stand their ground, which is incredibly difficult to do when you're on the verge of losing somebody. And also, the loved one had to agree with the contents of the living will.
Mhm.
Because if they didn't agree, then the loved one, the family could override the wishes of the patient.
It it's it's the trust that Dad laid, I was going to say on my shoulders, but it wasn't a burden. You know, it was a gift.
Yeah.
I mean, that kind of from being the child who didn't feel like she had a relationship with her father to having this, it's what I call a sacred trust.
Mhm.
And what I'm passionate about now and want your audience to know, I don't grieve the loss of my father like I grieve the loss of so many others. And that's because of his trust in me to do this thing at the end. So, do I miss him? Absolutely. Have there been times when something will happen and I'm a puddle of tears 14 years after he passed away? Absolutely. But what accompanies that sorrow is a sacred joy.
Mhm.
I wish I had that joy with my mother. I wish I had that joy with losing my brother. I don't,
Yeah.
because we didn't know what Mark wanted and we didn't know what mother wanted. But I did know with Dad.
Mhm. And there's something
So,
extra special about that end of life period. Yeah, I love that you use the word sacred. I really can't think of a more perfect word for honoring the final wishes of someone and supporting them through that death and dying process.
and what's my last memory of my dad? Is lying on the floor with him, telling him that I loved him, telling him that he was going to meet mom, and then praying, you know. So having the two, and as a therapist, I often tell clients that sound mental health is the ability to contain the paradox.
Yes.
You can have sorrow, you can have joy, and you can hold them in the very same place. I don't have the joy with mother, and I don't necessarily have the joy with my brother Mark, but with Dad, I have it.
Yeah.
So my children have my 5 wishes. My children have my advanced directives. We've talked about it from time to time. They know what I want. Now I know I need to review those documents. That's one of the things I need to put on my to-do list because it's been a while since I've written them. But those have been intimate conversations with my children.
Which is a precious gift for them as well.
Yes, yes.
I love that you're sharing this story. You're using words like sacred. You, I think, earlier referred to it as a gift as well. But so many people can't have these conversations. Why is that?
It's called the elephant in the room. You know, everybody knows it's there, death and taxes.
Yeah.
It's a hard thing to talk about. People are afraid to bring up the topic. People are afraid if they talk about it, they're telling their loved one, we want you to go. Would you just go? Um, we don't get raised with being open about it. It's like this verboten topic. Um, Maybe sex and death, we don't talk about those things. And we don't know how to approach it. What I learned from working in the retirement community, I had an open door policy. I was on the third floor and there were residents on the third floor. And I can't tell you the number of times that a resident would come in, plop themselves down, we'd start talking, and they'd say, I want to go. And what I did was say, tell me about it.
Yeah.
And they would just open it up. And the story was generally the same. I'm old. I've done all I wanted. My husband's gone. I hurt all the time. My friends are gone. I'm ready.
Yeah.
So what I learned from them is I didn't have to do anything, but listen,
Mhm.
tell me more. Tell me what makes you feel that way. Well, tell me about that. And they did. It was just an open invitation. So I didn't have to take it on. I just had to honor it. So again, we were talking earlier about being prepared.
Yeah.
Yeah, my journey along life was to be prepared. I hope that answers the question.
It does. It sounds like you were very prepared. And I love how you said you didn't have to take it on, you just had to honor it. There's so much power in that because I think that we can take on these heavy things and wear it like a burden and just it just drags us down and we don't know what to do with it. It feels bigger than us. And it's scary to maybe contemplate the potential death or the eventual death of a loved one. And we certainly, to your point, we don't want to miscommunicate that we're trying to rush them along.
Mm-hmm.
So what about, well, I wonder what you would have to say to a family member who maybe has an elderly parent. Maybe the elderly parent is not, or at least has not communicated that they are open to having that conversation. How might the loved one approach that?
One of the things that's nice about the five wishes, and by the way, that's an advanced directive with heart. It's $5. You can order it from fivewishes.org. They can also send you a booklet that talks about how to get those conversations going. Some relationships with parents are toxic.
Yes.
And if there's a toxic relationship, then I can't say that that conversation can be had. But if the relationship isn't toxic, to look for openings, to I'm thinking my head's going faster than my mouth, but I'm thinking about if they talk about retirement or if they talk about some of their health issues or if the health issues are big.
Mhm.
Hey, mom and dad, what if something happens? What do you want?
Right.
And be ready to sit back and listen. And of course, time and place and atmosphere. This is not something when you're sitting around the table eating pizza.
Right.
Um, to just be sensitive to the mood. When a book is written, you hand it out to people looking for reviews. And certain people read my book for that reason before it was published. And I had three wonderful experiences. One was from a young woman who every time her parents brought it up, she would say, no, 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 we're not talking about that. It's too soon. You're going to be around. She would push it away.
Yes.
Once she read Dying with Dad, she said, now I understand.
Yes.
And she initiated the conversation. Then there was an older gentleman in his 80s that had no idea what an advance directive even was. And when he read the book, and he read the book because he had read my first one, he said, where do I get this 5 wishes? He ordered it. He did it. He told his daughters that on his birthday, he wanted to Zoom and he wanted to talk about the 5 wishes. That was the present he wanted.
Wow.
So They were going over it with him. Da 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 da, all the things that are in there. And so it got to the point that he said he wanted to be cremated. Well, Dad, what do you want us to do with your ashes? Oh, I don't care. Throw them over a bridge. Doesn't matter then. And they said, wait a minute. Wouldn't you like your ashes to be spread at the farm where you grew up as a kid? And he said, oh, that's too much trouble.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, what if we'd really like to do that for you? He changed his 5 wishes.
Wow.
The final one was a woman in my writers group who had an acute illness, suffered for years, surgeries after surgeries, pretty constant pain, having to leave the job she loved and go on disability. She got the 5 wishes, sat down and did it with her family. We got word that she had chosen hospice.
Mm-hmm.
And her husband had a setup that we could each have 15 minutes conversation with her. In that 15-minute Zoom call that we did, all she kept doing was thanking me for the 5 wishes.
Oh my goodness.
My family knows what I want.
Yeah.
My family knows that it's time. My family has agreed. And so I'm choosing hospice. I'm choosing to go.
Yeah.
So what better can I ask?
No kidding.
That through the book,
Mm-hmm.
people really began to understand and take a hold of the beautiful part of facing a really, really tough thing. The title of the book is Fully Dying with Dad, Tough Talks for Easier Endings.
That's a perfect subtitle. Tough talks for easier endings.
Mm-hmm. So that would be my suggestion to having those conversations. First of all, to be open out to it. The other thing is to think about your own death and dying. And what do you want?
Exactly.
And if you can be clear about that,
Mm-hmm.
then that ought to help you to open up that conversation with someone else.
Right. You know, this whole conversation also reminds me of my own experience with my mom when she died. Because she helped so many of her patients go through their death experience, and she was often caught in between knowing what her patients wanted versus what the families or her superiors demanded. She felt that tug of war, and so she would talk to us, my brother and I, and other family members, and she said, "I do not resuscitate me, and if you do, I will come back and haunt you." And so that we knew, always, no matter what the situation is, there's always going to be a DNR. And she absolutely, under any circumstances, hold that. She said, please be my advocates. When I can't fight for myself, you are my voice.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you mentioned toxic families. I did have a toxic relationship with my mom, and eventually she disowned me. However, when I got the call that she was in the hospital, she was in a medically induced coma, everything in me said, no, no, absolutely not. Nobody is honoring her wishes. Why would she be in a medically induced coma? And I was there. And me and my brother and my mom's husband were able to band together and say, no, this is not what she would want. And we called the family, the whole family, and we all just stood around her bed and had our hands on her, holding her hands, and we were just with her when we turned off the machine. And despite having had a toxic experience, a toxic relationship with my mother, there was a lot of maybe redemption, and I'm not sure if redemption, I felt like our relationship was redeemed. And there was just forgiveness going in both directions. It was just an honor to be a part of her experience. And also to know that I didn't carry grudges. I knew what her wishes were, and I was going to show up and make sure that her voice was heard when she couldn't shout it.
Hmm.
So I love your story so much. It's just such a joy and such an inspiration to have a little window into your experiences those final years with your father that took you through the writing of both of these books.
Hmm. Hmm. I, there's a giggle. There's just, there's just a giggle. I am so blessed. I am just so blessed to have been able to do that.
How did it change you?
It rounded me out. It took off the rough edges. It made me feel whole.
Mhm.
I came from a dysfunctional family, and because I'm a psychotherapist, you can have a dysfunctional family meter. Okay. And
Mhm.
some are way over at 10, and some are at 2, and some are at 3. And and ours was slightly. Okay. So I didn't grow up with an emotional foundation that I really needed to have. And through lots of therapy, discovered that my parents couldn't do it.
Right.
They did the best that they could do, but they didn't have that emotional foundation. They didn't know what to do. If I was crying over something, and I cried a lot as a little kid, I got sent to my room, you know. So with particularly being able to do this with my dad, and particularly so late in my life, yeah, the rough edges are gone. It rounded me out. It gave me this wholeness that I can treasure. And I'm not afraid of dying. I am afraid of the process,
Mm.
but I'm not afraid of dying uh, because of what happened with me and dad. And because this is an additional little story. When my mother was pregnant with me and I was about to be delivered, off they went to the hospital. And my mother requested a private room, and they didn't have any, and she was ticked.
Mm.
You know, this public thing that she was going to do with another person. Anyway, so thank God, because in the middle of the night, her roommate heard this drip, drip, drip. The roommate called, nurses came, mom was hemorrhaging.
Oh my goodness.
And my mother said she had the white light, she had the tunnel.
Mm.
She was standing over herself, watching all of this happen. She was at profound peace.
Mm.
She was really ticked that they brought her back. It was so nice wherever she was. So I've always been, since I've known that story, grounded
Mm.
in that there is something to come after. There is something there. So no, I'm not afraid of dying. I just maybe don't like the process. I
Yeah.
don't want to get weak and infirm.
Exactly. Exactly. Which that's an important distinction, right? The process versus the finality. But
Mhm.
what you're saying is part of why you don't fear death is because it's not necessarily a finality, it's a transition.
It's the transition.
I wonder if there are any final thoughts you would like to leave our audience with.
I think in all reality, I've said it all, you
Mm.
know, that this whole conversation rolls around this beautiful sacred experience that I had with my father.
Yvonne, thank you for sharing that beautiful sacred experience with me and with all of our listeners. It was a joy and an inspiration to hear your story.
Thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to tell it.
Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Becoming and Belonging. I'd love to hear from you. What was your biggest takeaway from today's episode? Share your thoughts, reflections, any questions that came up. You can connect on social media or leave a comment wherever you're tuning in to keep the conversation going. If you found this episode meaningful, subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who might benefit from it. Until next time, keep growing, keep healing, and remember, you belong here.